From soil to seed to pollination. So far in this series, we've tracked life through different habitats and complex, diverse processes around the world. We've followed research globally across environments in different climate zones, facing different exploitations, different challenges, and different opportunities. This time, we look at how we can combine knowledge to rebuild or regenerate parts of our natural world that are under strain, addressing the biodiversity crisis and helping make our precious landscapes more resilient to other pressures.
We need win-win scenarios that work for biodiversity, that work for people, that work for climate change. One of the things we're really good at is using evidence to work out the best and fastest and fairest way to achieve those things. And that is what I think science can do to help with all of these grand global challenges that we face as a society.
I'm Dr. Maya Rose Craig, and this is Unearthed, Nature Needs Us, from the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. Alongside ongoing research and conservation work to address the drivers of climate change and biodiversity loss, regeneration projects seek to restore ailing habitats. Making sure the action we do take does more good than harm is essential.
If we leave things alone, most systems will potentially recover. Now, there's challenges with invasive species and climate change and so on, but the timescales might be far longer than we're comfortable with.
There is hope today that by combining international resources, collaborative research, and traditional knowledge, we have an opportunity to supercharge nature's recovery like never before. That also means supercharging the recovery of species, restoring the services provided by ecosystems, and looking again at models for how we can sustainably generate economic and social value from the natural world. Doing this all successfully comes down to the species, the resources, the timing, and, of course, people and practice. Tim Pearce is the African Partnerships Coordinator at the Millennium Seed Bank at Wakehurst, Kew's Wild Botanic Garden in Sussex. He says we have a duty to protect species from extinction, even if we don't yet understand their place in our ecosystems.
It's all part of that functioning ecosystem that we have to make sure we maintain in a healthy way. Somebody asked me once, but why is that important? It's only a little succulent plant. It's like, well, yes, there is a moral thing here about, is it acceptable to let anything go extinct? Morally, no, it's absolutely not. Biologically, there's also a strong argument to say, well, you can't just let things go extinct because we really don't fully understand what knock-on effect that has to the rest of their habitat. Is it okay to let the Scottish midge or the mosquito go extinct? I challenge anybody to tell me, well, we know exactly what's going to happen if that is the case. So there's a biological imperative to make sure that we don't lose species, but also there's a moral thing there. Not on my watch, thank you.
Since the beginning of time, nature has been changing, evolving, and responding to fluctuating conditions and influences, building on the interactions and cycles of support, symbiosis, consumption, or destruction that remain stable for a while, until the balance shifts and it changes all over again. Across this series, we've heard about prairies, mountains, salt marshes, meadows, farms, and forests. Regeneration of these varied habitats gives us the opportunity to shore up their services as carbon sinks, as well as the resources they provide us with. Dr. James Burrell is a research leader in agrobiodiversity at Kew. That means he's interested in projects that feature the conservation of wild as well as agricultural biodiversity.
I think regeneration is simply recovery, perhaps, of a habitat that was there before. Restoration might be restoring it a little bit more accurately. Both of those things can happen naturally because disturbances are natural processes in ecosystems, or they may get stuck because of things we've done or conversions of habitats we've made and might need a small or large assistance from us. The goal generally is to Improved biodiversity makes systems more resilient to stresses like climate change and human impacts. And the way we do it in different places is likely to be very different. It's much easier to avoid losing forest than it is to restore it. So I would say the principal thing we try to do is avoid deforestation. That is in turn through trying to support the people who live around forests. Better lives, livelihood, reduced poverty, increased food security, to avoid the need to rely on turning forests into other types of resources or converting the land for agriculture. We do a lot of work on that in Madagascar and Ethiopia, both of which have lost a lot of forest. I'd probably point out that the UK has also lost an enormous amount of forest, just a longer time ago, so we tend to forget about that. There's a huge number of projects around the world, and a lot of them, I mean, it's an enormous amount of work, and it's going to take timescales far longer than any of our funding programs, right? You're lucky if you get a 3-year grant. So how do we expect to turn something into forest with improved canopy cover, improved connectivity in those kind of timescales? So the amount of time we're thinking about is massive. In many countries, the key is adjusting grazing. In places where there are no seed sources, it may be a case that we need to help source those seeds and provide pioneer species that change the conditions, add shade, add humidity, to allow then other species to come back later. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of different places, a lot of different types of forest, and it's not just forests we need to restore, scrubland, shrubland. So an enormous diversity of different approaches. And I'd say it's a very young field, to be honest. I mean, there's a huge amount of questions we still have about the best and most effective and cost-effective ways to do it.
Our forests, covering around 31% of the Earth's landmass, support life everywhere, moderating its temperature, sinking carbon, holding water, and supporting human lives and livelihoods. In the last 150 years, we've been losing them at an unprecedented rate. But these ecosystems developed over hundreds of millions of years, some time after plants had first colonized land. Will we be able to replace them at the same rate at which they disappeared? Or is unsustainable human activity an indelible mark on natural history? Katie Field, professor in plant soil processes at the University of Gloucestershire, explained how scientists are gathering information from the origin stories of forests.
Plants first came onto the land sort of 450, 500 million years ago, but trees and forests evolved a lot later. So they weren't a thing until maybe 390, 400 million years ago. Basically, there's a lot of evolution happened in that 100 million years. And that includes fungi and it includes the plants themselves. Today, fungi play a really key role in the forest ecosystem. They serve as important decomposers. So they help cycle nutrients from litter that falls from trees or other dead understory plants. So they recycle that litter into nutrients that are more available for plants to take up through their roots. Other types of fungi form associations with the roots. These are ectomycorrhizal fungi, and they form very intimate associations with the root tips, and they sort of extend the area of the root system effectively, forming a web beneath the soil that helps plants get access to more nutrients in the soil. They also have potential to form networks, so they can form these really vast webs beneath the soil surface, which again can help them move nutrients through the ecosystem and distribute carbon below the ground. So they have this really important role with trees. We're still learning a lot about the functionality of those associations, in particular what the role of those fungi are in moving nutrients and moving carbon.
Understanding the systems and processes that build and maintain a healthy forest isn't just about studying what we see today. In fact, the past can offer us some powerful insights into how modern-day plants and species interact too.
In Aberdeenshire, there's this little village called Rhynie, which is pretty unremarkable to look at. But when you scratch the surface, there's this incredible fossil bed. It's this most amazing plant fossils preserved there that reflect the flora of this sort of 412 million year old landscape, I think. So it's one of the really early assemblages of terrestrial plants that we're able to study. The preservation there is really, really incredible, largely down to the environmental conditions at that site at that time. So although today is lush green fields, it's kind of like a farming landscape, 400 million years ago, it was a hotbed of tectonic activity. It was sort of hot springs, very silicified waters. And essentially when organic matter or dead leaves or plants fell over into the water and springs, they turned into fossils very quickly because of all of the silica in the water. I mean, it preserved all of the organic matter exquisitely. So today, when we look at these fossils, they're just almost perfect condition. And you can even make out individual cells within the fossils when you look at them down a microscope. And what it tells us is loads of really unique information about what the plants were like at that time that were sort of early land plants. It tells us what the communities of plants looked like, so we're able to recreate landscapes. And it also tells us a little bit about kind of their strategies for adapting to land. So we're able to look at some of the key physiological innovations. So we're able to look at stomata, the development of roots and rhizoids, and we're able to also see sort of interactions with other organisms. So there's a lot of microorganisms preserved in this fossil bed as well. So you're able to see interactions with pathogens and pests, as well as sort of symbiotic fungi that occupy the cells within the cortex of lots of these different plants that were present at that time. So it's a really vital resource. I think one of the most exciting things about these Rhynie chert fossils from my perspective is the preservation of those fungal associates in situ, and the fact that we can actually see structures that look almost identical to modern day mycorrhizal structures. And although, we don't have time machines, we can use modern day plants that share some of the characteristics of those early plants. And we can use mycorrhizal fungi, and we can look to see how are they functioning, what are they doing in these modern plants. And if we expose those plants and fungi to simulated ancient atmospheres in controlled environment chambers, for example, you can simulate how these symbioses would have functioned in ancient times. And from that, by exploring the plasticity of that relationship, so pushing the boundaries of what it can cope with and how does it respond to those different environments, we can start to hypothesize about what they would have been doing 500 million years ago.
Katie says it's also important to look beyond our favourite charismatic species to make sure we get the fullest picture.
Maintaining the diversity of some of these more sort of overlooked species, particularly bryophytes, which don't receive as much attention as kind of the more showy flowering plants. We've got so much to learn from them, and I think anything we can do to try to preserve the biodiversity in those groups, I think is vital for our understanding, not just of Earth's past, but also potentially its future.
When it comes to resilient habitats, our modern world doesn't just present challenges in terms of climate and deforestation. In an age of international trade, in spite of regulation and controls, invasive species and diseases can still find their way into habitats through human action, changing the face of familiar landscapes dramatically. Ash dieback is one such issue that forests are facing today. This fungus threatens to kill up to 80% of ash trees in the UK, disrupting all the species that rely upon them. Russell Croft, the Arboretum manager at Wakehurst, showed us how Kew is managing this devastating problem.
The fungus is from Asia, and it's worked its way across Europe to the UK. It may have come initially to the UK in 2012 on plant material that was brought into Norfolk. I think that's pretty much what everyone agrees happened. But there is a chance that it was blown in as well. The spores are windborne. I think that they can travel about 10 miles or so, so there's a chance that could have blown over the channel. In that time, because of the trees' lack of tolerance to this alien fungi that they've not ever experienced before, it's hit them very hard. There isn't a way to stop its spread. It's here in the country now, and the important work is to find trees that have got a high degree of tolerance, and those will be the seed trees of the future. So when we think about repopulating the woodlands that were once dominated by ash trees, we have to find that 5% of trees that have a tolerance and then look to gather seed from them and replant them. We're here in Loder Valley Nature Reserve today. It's a broadleaf woodland. The species I'm looking around, it's a hazel understory with oak ash standards, with some sycamore regeneration in and around the place. The nature reserve is quite interesting. It does have quite a lot of diversity. It creates a really great habitat for dormice. So there's like an arboreal walkway, so that where the branches cross the rides, it's sort of an archway. It gives the dormice a chance to move around the canopy. We're not looking at a formal arboretum here. It's definitely like a wild nature reserve. The surrounding area is surrounded by farmland, and we're looking across the part of the Ardingly Reservoir across to Hanging Meadow, which is just around the corner. There's a lot of bird life here on the reservoir. There's terns, cormorants, osprey, sand martins, kingfishers, so there's quite a lot going on. We shut the Loder Valley Nature Reserve just over 18 months ago because of concerns about safety, and that's specifically related to ash dieback, which has resulted in removing about 100 trees that are next to the path. We've definitely become more concerned about whole tree failure. What we're really noticing is secondary infection with fungi like honey fungus. That affects the roots of the trees and makes them much more unstable and prone to blowing over. When you've got a tree that's been weakened year on year by ash dieback fungus, so the fungus is an airborne spore, it goes around, it lands on the leaves, it kills the leaves, and all of this is like putting more stress on the tree. So it's losing the ability to make food for itself, and it's expending more energy to compensate for that. And trees under stress, they are then susceptible to other fungi. There's just under 1,000 species of plants and animals that have a relationship with ash trees, and of that, just under 40, about 35, 36 species that are obligate to ash, and that is predominantly fungi, lichen and insects, invertebrates.
And beyond the threat to safety, or the survival of species that depend upon it, the loss of ash in our landscapes means a dent to our social history and economics too. Researchers predict the economic cost in the UK could be as high as £15 billion.
For us in this area, ash is really, really abundant. It's a big part of the woodlands. There's a big history of charcoal making, a lot of wood turning and tool making and so on. So I think ash is definitely a predominant tree, not just in the landscape, but in everyone's sort of living history of what it was actually used for as a product and how it was harvested and used. But I think it's really safe to say if you look anywhere around Sussex, all the work that's been done roadside by the local councils, landowners to remove ash trees that are next to highways, there's a considerable amount of money that's having to be spent to sort of give people this peace of mind that trees aren't going to be falling on cars, falling on people, blocking roads. And when I'm looking around now, I can see some trees that we've monolithed. I can see some trees that are waiting to be felled. I can see some trees that have been felled and that are on the ground. And there's overall been so much work in the last coming up to 5 years that when I think about what I did before as a job, I'm not quite sure how we managed to fit everything in as a team, because we're still doing all of the work that we would normally do, the planting, the tree care, that's all still going on. But on top of that, we've had this massive issue of hundreds and hundreds of trees to remove.
Like many others up and down the country, the landscape and horticulture teams at Wakehurst have worked in often dangerous situations and challenging weather to maintain the safety and aesthetic of the reserve here. Russell hopes that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that when visitors can get back into the reserve, they'll see a changed but nevertheless biodiverse environment.
We're talking about a loss of a species, loss of a change of a habitat, and the best that we can do is try and mitigate that by doing good environmental conservation work. And part of that is, where possible, leaving these trees standing to fall over and decay over time, so that they provide a good habitat for, nesting birds, woodpeckers, invertebrates. When we come in here next year, you really won't see an awful lot of the work that's gone on this winter. There's so much light that's been brought into the woodland floor. All of the dead wood and the tops and the timber that's been left will have been grown over It'd be very difficult to see what's gone on and what's happened, but we'll all know that dead wood's there decomposing and being useful for the environment here and the ecology of the woodland.
As we're hearing, the restoration and protection of habitats isn't about excluding humans and letting the rest of nature take its course. The lives and livelihoods of people living alongside threatened or protected habitats are a crucial part of successful conservation and restoration, and harnessing local knowledge is vital. Kew works with partners around the world to make sure science can be placed into action by the people who know the environment best. The Millennium Seed Bank, or MSB, now holds the world's most extensive collection of global tree genetic resources in the form of seeds. Eleanor Bremen is a senior research leader in seed conservation at the MSB.
The work here at the MSB is helping scientists all around the world to investigate and help resolve the biodiversity crisis. The collections we hold at the Millennium Seed Bank are really a living collection. These seeds are alive. We test their viability regularly to make sure they're still alive. And because of that, each of those seeds has the potential to turn back into a new plant and offers new possibilities. And part of the collection is stored here at the MSB, but we also store the seeds in the country of origin, which means they're available for use there as well. So while we might use the seeds here in the UK or send them out to users all around the world, our partners in the country where the seeds came from also have those collections, so can use them more readily in their natural environments.
As Eleanor says, holding on to this collection and carrying out research is just the start of the journey. The Western Global Tree Seed Bank programme is a huge scientific project to conserve some of the world's rarest, endangered and useful tree and shrub species, as well as carrying out vital tree conservation research in order to retain a significant resource for people and planet. Now, the seed bank is being unlocked to focus on the use of these seeds and scale up native species supply for restoration, as well as forest restoration programmes across the tropics. We met a few of Kew's international programme partners on a training visit.
I'm Maif. I come from Madagascar. I work at the SNGF, the National Seed Treat Center.
I'm Nambin. I come from Madagascar. I work at SNGF, the National Tree Seed Center.
For me, for the department production, it is for the conservation of seeds in ambient temperature.
For the research department, we doing the physiological seeds and improving the germination rate and verify the quality of the seeds before storing and selling.
I'm Georgina Wilkinson, and I'm working for SANBI, South African National Biodiversity. At the SANBI Botanical Garden, I'm working for this year, it's going to be 28 years, and for the MSB, it's 5 years. We already go out and give training how to germinate seeds, how to grow it, the species, how to collect seeds in the field. So that all kind of program that we gave to the educational people, children and right through. The one department in our building is collecting seeds. Then it comes to me. Then I do the processing and do the labeling and the data capturing, and then do the packing, and then we ship it to the MSB in the UK. We have a huge amount of species that is threatened. Nearly a quarter of our plants are threatened. And we're facing a significant challenges with poaching in our succulent plants and bulb plants. Many of them are single locality species. So we are busy to collecting seeds from it to make the seeds secure. The other challenges that we also is plants. We also keep, and we don't have enough space. We're running out of space. The whole nursery is full of plants. We don't actually know really the locality where some of the plants come from. At the moment, they are working on it to trace where the locality is and then to go and replant it.
Whilst around the world, teams are collecting seeds and cultivating them in nurseries, the next step is to successfully transition these plants into diverse habitats where they can thrive and support the next generation of nature. Every location has its own unique challenges for species, but there are some golden rules for successful regeneration that we've learnt to follow through years of experimentation. Here's James Burrell again.
One is maintaining genetic diversity, because when you maintain genetic diversity in whatever you're trying to restore and in the natural populations occurring alongside them, that gives you options for the future. We don't know what the future stress or challenge is going to be. And the more genetic diversity you can maintain, the more chance you have of finding a way to overcome those future stresses. So I would say that's important. The second thing I would say is whatever restoration project you have or whatever you do, document it and report it, especially if it doesn't work. One of the big problems we have is repeating mistakes because we don't know they're mistakes. It's much easier to publish a wonderfully successful restoration project than it is an abysmal failure. So whatever we do, we should try to make sure we're doing it in such a way that we can draw conclusions about what worked and what didn't, and write that up in a way that other people can learn from it. And that's the way we'll all make progress. I think there was a great paper that said, most people don't plant trees for carbon or biodiversity, they plant it for money. And maybe we need to think carefully about what are the motivations in different countries for trying to restore or increase forest cover, and then do it in such a way that we try to maximise those benefits that people are trying to see. If you look at the mortality of trees in the UK that are freshly planted, it's very high. The other issue is beyond, species in the right place, it's also the right genotype. And what I mean by genotype, it's that within any species, like an oak tree in the UK, as you travel across the UK, you find many subtly different varieties of oak. There may be oaks that are more adapted to living on the coast, oaks more adapted to living on flooded ground or on higher elevations. A lot of our group's work is about trying to understand how those genotypes are adapted to slightly different environments, and we call this local adaptation. Now, whether we like it or not, the conditions that any tree faces growing anywhere in the UK are going to change over the next 50, 100 years, and they've already been changing. Should we just try and plant exactly the same genotype that was there 100 years ago? Or should we think about what those conditions are going to be like in the future and try and plant a genotype that is going to be adapted to the conditions that location will face in the future? And that's tricky because that relies on us being really good at predicting what it's going to be like. But I think we're getting better and better at that, and we can do experiments to try and see how accurate we are. That's also interfering, and it's also admitting that climate change is going to happen and the conditions are going to change. So our group, we sort of work on disease and we work on stresses, and I sort of consider them all to be the same thing. We need to try and identify either populations that within them have enough diversity that some will survive, or genotypes that are tolerant of those stresses, and those are the ones you reintroduce. The other way is if you have large enough populations with large enough genetic diversity and connectivity and they successfully regenerate, then you can sort of let nature take its course. Maybe it's fine if 80% die, but the 20% are tolerant and then they recover really quickly. I think the challenge we have is when you have a whole series of stresses coming all together or in quick succession. Ash dieback, very serious, going to probably have very high mortality in the UK and already is. Maybe in isolation, that would be bad enough. But then you've got stresses such as climate change and drought, which is also going to mean a large proportion of the population maybe can't tolerate future conditions. So when you compound all of those stresses all at once and perhaps new emerging diseases in the future, that becomes a problem that's greater than the sum of its parts.
The UK has committed to establishing 30,000 hectares of woodland annually by 2050. The plan is to achieve that with a mix of tree planting, but also natural regeneration. Down south, amongst the rolling Hampshire farmlands, woods and hedgerows, lies Home Farm. This special place is one of the South's biggest native woodland creation sites. Nicola Cotterill is a forest ecologist for forest research. She explained what that means.
Often naturally colonised and naturally regenerated get confused. Naturally colonised is where an already established woodland species spreads into a non-wooded area. So the land can be formerly arable, grassland, or basically land that was not previously woodland, whereas natural regeneration is when an already wooded area regenerates into a formerly wooded area. Planted are just that, such as we have here at this site, Home Farm. The Woodland Trust have subsidised the natural colonisation with planting as well. So Home Farm was previously part of various land estates until it came up for sale in the 60s, I believe. The Woodland Trust have since acquired the land. So it's formerly agricultural farm. The site's now a mixture of planted secondary woodland, some remnant conifer plantations, some open grassland with scrub, and then you've got Wigdell Copse, which is the ancient semi-natural woodland. In terms of tree species, we can see a lot of oak, birch, beech, hazel. More scrubby species, they're like hawthorn and blackthorn. There's also still some ash around. You might be lucky to spot a barn owl or skylark, they're quite popular here. Home Farm is definitely one of the most diverse populations of many species in this region. Woodland diversification is a key topic of research for us at Forest Research. My project is the Centre for Forest Protection, which brings together forest research and Kew Gardens. Then we're combining the strength and expertise of each organisation. There are an increasing number of threats to our woodlands and trees, not only from climate change but pests and disease. So the more we can work together, the better the outcome. There are always new pests and diseases being discovered. Currently our oaks are suffering at the moment, especially with acute oak decline, oak processionary moth as well. There is a lot of ash here on this site, so ash dieback is an issue. In terms of our project, our project is specifically evaluating genetic diversity in planted and naturally colonised young woodlands. This involved tracking planted populations back to seed source. We needed to make sure planted populations were sourced from somewhere in the UK and not somewhere else in Europe. We needed to make sure the naturally colonised couldn't have come from the planted populations, so this was no easy task. A higher genetic diversity within populations allows species to adapt to future environmental changes. I mean, if we rush to plant or there is a lack of stock, they might not be well adapted to the area. By reducing diversity means we are potentially reducing the potential for adaptation to take place. Genetics is quite a complex subject, but if we just think the more diversity, the better for biodiversity.
Around the world, there are landscapes with unique, complex, economic, social and geographical challenges for reforestation projects. And it's in these contexts that researchers and conservationists must adapt. In Thailand, agriculture has been a big driver of deforestation, although logging was banned here in the 1980s. Restoring these landscapes against the backdrop of a changing climate raises questions for scientists. Which species are endangered right now? How resilient are the current species going to be in the future? And where should genetically different seeds be used to support diversity and resilience of future forest habitats? Stephen Elliott is a lecturer at Chiang Mai University in northern Thailand and co-director of FORU, which stands for the Forest Restoration Research Unit based there.
The goal of the unit is to come up with scientifically proven, effective methods of restoring tropical forest ecosystems. Of course, we specialise in the ecosystems of northern Thailand, but we've also worked in southern Thailand and central Thailand and Cambodia and China and Indonesia and many other countries.
Whilst the primary goal is in scientific research, Stephen's passionate about making sure people who live there with the forests are able to put this knowledge into action.
there's no point in just sort of writing the academic papers and putting them into journals where they sit in dusty libraries or online in some obscure journal website. You have to take your research results and get out there and put them in the hands of the stakeholders that are directly involved in forest restoration or who benefit from forest restoration. The group we work with probably most are actually school kids and teachers because they have most to gain from the future regeneration of forests. Right now, we're concentrating on the schools around Chiang Mai in northern Thailand. We're helping the teachers there to build tree nurseries in their own schools. And then we take the kids out into the forest and get them collecting seeds. If they collect too many, they put the seeds into the seed bank and they swap those seeds with other schools. Then we take them through the process of extracting the seeds from the fruits and then getting those seeds to germinate. When the little seedlings are big enough, the most fun part of the whole exercise is then transferring those seedlings into big plastic bags and getting them to grow up ready for planting. And in the middle weekend of June, around about then, we take the kids out and we have planting plots where we're doing our experiments. So the seedlings that they grow in their schools are not only putting back the forest, but it's also contributing to scientific experiments because we'll end up monitoring those trees and the data will go into our published papers eventually. Taking them out into the forest, they really enjoy that, even if it's pouring down with rain. They put on their plastic Macintoshes and off they go.
Children can work towards a certificate from the university that hopefully inspires a further education in science. Meanwhile, in the tree nurseries, studies into germination and growth rates of the seeds all feeds into the optimum planting time and how that connects with the planting date in mid-June.
So the research is to figure out how you can manipulate the dormancy with treatments or speed up or sometimes slow down the growth of the trees by adding or not adding fertilizer, pruning and that sort of thing. And so that your planting stock are all ready to go at the middle weekend of June. We call it production scheduling. So the trees go into the ground in the middle weekend of June and then we start to monitor them. So you'll do a baseline monitoring about a week or so after they go into the ground, measure the height. We also monitor the width of the crown, how fast the crowns of the trees are expanding and shading out the weeds. And then you go back at the end of the first rainy season and you go back at the end of the second rainy, maybe the third rainy season, and you start to calculate relative growth rates and crown expansion, survival and mortality, of course, is very important as well. And then you can start to really see which species are working, which species are so fragile that you really can't plant them out, come back later.
The team is also able to measure how much carbon is stored at these sites.
With carbon accumulation, you could theoretically convert that into carbon credits, which is a source of money coming in. And of course, the other aspect of it that we monitor is biodiversity. We have a lot of fun with camera traps. And that's one of the most enjoyable parts of the job, is to come up to your camera trap in a forest that you've kind of had a hand in recreating, and then you get the memory card out of the camera trap and there's a spotted leopard cat or there's a hog badger or there's a barking deer there, and that's really satisfying to know that those animals are coming in from remnant forests around the areas that you plant, and they're actually using the resources, the natural resources that you've created with your forest. And bird watching, of course, we do a lot of bird watching. We had a chap recently, and he was doing bryophytes, mosses and liverworts, and he found that there are actually more mosses and liverworts in the restored forest than there is in native forest.
The technique the team use is a version of what's called the framework species method, which they're able to transfer to different contexts for regeneration research and development.
The generic technique was first coined by a fellow called Nigel Tucker, who is still a forester in Queensland, Australia. So we, right at the beginning of the project, we went there to learn the technique, and then we sort of picked it up and modified it and developed it to suit the species and the environment, even the socio-economic context of northern Thailand. So we had other countries looking at this saying, well, can we do the same thing? So we did a project a few years back where we worked with the Forest Administration in China, We work with the Forest Administration in Cambodia and Laos. And so we ended up franchising almost the FORU concept of setting up a research unit to look into this framework species technique and find the magic framework species that are going to work for their particular forests. We're working now with Indonesians under this new project with Q. So they want to do more or less the same thing. The Mount Ciremai National Park people want to set up over there.
Indonesia is home to such biodiverse, rich environments that it's been highlighted as a key area to conserve genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. It includes many species that cannot be found anywhere else on Earth. But as the population has grown and the country has developed, there have been strains on the landscape. Dr. Dian Latifa works in the Research Centre for Applied Botany under the National Research and Innovation Agency of Indonesia, or BRIN. BRIN has been an important MSB partner for several years, and Dian's part of the team working on the Mount Ciremai project that Steve mentioned.
We use the method called framework species. So firstly, we need to survey the Mount Ciremai near the same elevation of the restoration area at Lambosir, around 200 meters above sea level. One area that is degraded because historically that area is quite prone to the fire, quite harsh or dry because historically the soil is combined with hardened lava, so a lot of rocks in our restoration area. So we choose species especially when the seeds are available or the seedlings are available, and a lot of them are natives or endemic to the mountain. In the future, hopefully we have many species that is tolerant to drought and also a species that resemble with the reference species that we studied already from the forest nearby in the National Park of Mount Ciremai.
Dian works with Dr. Yayan Kusuma. He explained why selecting the right plants for repopulation of degraded areas is so important to successful schemes.
Not all species well adapted to dry areas. We have to be sure that we select the correct and proper species. And also they have some species have very specific habitat and specific niche requirements. Altitude as well, elevations as well are also important. Another thing is invasive species as well need to be aware of. Selecting the source of these regenerations is also important. When we collect seeds and also seedlings, we have to be sure whether the seeds or seedling is in a good conditions, because if we also collect seeds or seedlings that already suffer diseases, it's also to be avoided because it can infect another individuals that already available either in the nurseries or in the restoration areas. Forests can help to regulate the water and also help to prevent flooding and landslides. Moreover, forests also provide many ecosystem services, such as pollination services, because around the forest area, mostly around the mountains, in Java especially, so many agriculture areas, and those agriculture areas needs to be pollinated. And somehow, at some point, forests are the habitat or the home of many pollinators that can help the farmers to pollinate their crops and help them to increase their productivities. That is why there are so many benefits to have forests around us. And restoring the degraded areas back into the forest will provide a lot of benefits for humankind.
Sharing knowledge and methodologies that work across borders is so important when it comes to supporting our natural world. Appraising these learnings and mistakes gives us the best chance of repairing the damage caused by past human activity. But there are many ideas around how this can be done successfully. Dr. Kate Hardwick oversees many of the Millennium Seed Bank's projects, particularly in Asia, where so much of this work is taking place. She was joined by Isabella Tree, author and conservationist, to discuss what successful regeneration might look like in the future.
Hello, my name's Kate Hardwick and I'm the Restoration Coordinator for the Millennium Seed Bank Programme. So I'm absolutely delighted here to be talking to Isabella Tree. I'm a huge fan of you and love what you've been doing at NEP. Absolutely fascinated. Could you please introduce yourself?
Finally found a subject that fits the name. I guess I've sort of rather stumbled into conservation and ecology by accident, but I co-own with my husband Charlie Burrell a 3,500 acre estate in West Sussex, which when we took it on in the 1980s was a failing farm. We're on very marginal land, very heavy clay. And in sort of the year 2000 took this step to rewild. And that was really just turning it over to nature, putting some drivers in place to kickstart the system and get nature back again. And it's been the most astonishing success. So I wrote a book in 2018 called Wilding, and I think it just hit the zeitgeist.
That is what's so fascinating about what you've done at NEP. Since then, the word rewilding has really sort of become mainstream, and in my opinion, a lot of people misuse it or use it in a kind of rather woolly way. And so I think what would be really helpful here is if we could perhaps dig into what's the difference between rewilding and restoration, or ecological restoration, or habitat restoration.
I think the way we frame it is that it's different from conventional conservation, where, you know, you have an area of land that you're trying to hold in static, I suppose, for the benefit of that habitat. It may be a very rare habitat or a very rare species or suite of species, and you're doing absolutely everything you can to preserve those species. So you're actually holding nature at bay. But we know across the broad spectrum that biodiversity is still crashing. And those little oases are not going to be able to turn back the tide. In fact, they too will fail if they're not connected with other areas to preserve genetic diversity and the like. They're very vulnerable to climate change and disease. So what do you do to kind of connect those little areas of nature together? And it's really inspired by the work of Dutch ecologist Frans Vera. And what he was saying really excited us, because he was saying that in all our imaginings of what temperate zone Europe would have been, actually in our imaginings, we've forgotten all the huge herds of animals that would have been here. Aurochs, the original cow, tarpan, the original horse, deer, wild boar, elk. We used to have water buffalo, a European water buffalo, till we hunted them to extinction. Beavers by the millions. And all of these would have been shifting the landscape, driving a much more open, diverse matrix of habitats. And if you want to restore nature, you need to go back to that thinking of using the animals, the fauna, as drivers of the system.
Rewilding is often seen as being at the less active end of perhaps a passive to active continuum of activities to help to heal a landscape. So when we're talking about ecological or habitat restoration, I quite like the Society for Ecological Restoration definition, the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged or restored. And the way I see it is that rewilding is one method of that restoring process.
We see, I think, rewilding as being on a spectrum. So at the wildest end, it's all about scale. So at the wildest end, you may have the Serengeti, the Yellowstone National Park, Alaska. You know, you've got your fully functioning ecosystems, you've got apex predators, the whole trophic cascades are functioning. Humans don't need and shouldn't need to intervene at all. When you get to a size of NEP, you know, the main intervention in the absence of the wolf and the bear and the lynx is to be the predator, to control the numbers of herbivores. Obviously, if you left a piece of land for hundreds, if not thousands of years, it would do something really extraordinary. It would be, but we haven't got that time to wait. But it's thinking in terms of natural processes, I think, that changes the management style and the outcomes, and always thinking of biodiversity first.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting word to use. What exactly do we mean by biodiversity? And so in my mind, it's about trying to restore that complex network of species. So not just plants, but as you're saying, plants and animals, but also we can't forget invertebrates and microorganisms and the soil bacteria, the soil fungi, and trying to perhaps not entirely restore, but move towards that just complex web of interactions that's developed over tens of thousands of years, and which is so often forgotten in so-called restoration or reforestation projects. For example, the English oak tree supports over 2,000 different species of animals, plants, microorganisms. And if you bring in another species, it doesn't have those interactions. It hasn't evolved as part of that web. And so it's probably not going to support the other biodiversity in the same way that a native species would. One thing that Kew wanted to do was raising awareness of the importance of native species and not plastering the landscape with monocultures of exotic species. This is absolutely what we're trying to fight against.
I think certainly from the rewilding perspective, and I know, Kew has done incredible work on this and advocating natural regeneration wherever possible and getting away from the sort of gravy train of planting trees. From our point of view, the sapling in a polypropylene tube is the last resort. Its carbon footprint is already high, and we've never seemed to measure that in the final tally of how much we expect these trees to sequester. We forget about the importance of the genetic diversity of the trees themselves. We look at our great oaks outside, and they're being pollinated from all directions and from all different climates. And so they themselves are going to be producing the seeds that will have a chance of surviving climate change. We have a really exciting study that was done last year by AgriCarbon, funded by the government, by Unearthed, into the carbon storage of our soils. And they've found that the carbon stored in just our soil in the rewilding project is equivalent to a 15 to 20 year plantation. And that's just in our soils.
So even if you think that some introduction of biological materials, some tree planting is necessary, first of all, diagnose the site. So how much self-healing is going to be possible? Go and look at the site, look under the weeds, count how many natural regenerants are there, and factor those into the whole process. Because what you see so often is that somebody decides, I want to reforest this hillside. They go in with the bulldozers, the strimmers, clear the site and just hack back any natural regeneration that's already happening there, and then replace it with planted trees, and half of them are probably going to die.
So, as you say, you often don't know what's still there and what might come back. We've been to visit several places in Europe recently, in particular the Coa Valley in Portugal, which is absolutely desperately fire prone. You've got these bleak mountainsides with not a tree that have been burnt, most of it through anthropogenic fire sources. Very dry, tinder dry climate. And so they're now using animals to kickstart the soil again. So using toros, a kind of throwback, breed-back version of the aurochs, and wild ponies to go in and, first of all, to browse that ignitable vegetation, the dry, thatchy stuff that catches fire, but also for their dung to restore the soil so it can start to function again and hold moisture, and also to transfer native seeds. And once those thatchy, dominant, often pioneer and non-native species are browsed, and you start to begin to see native plants coming back.
This is again why I think that the diagnostic process is really important as a first step, just to sort of have a look at this and just to say, what are the options? How much natural regeneration is there? Is there the potential? Is there a missing key animal species that I could reintroduce? So one example from the Millennium Seed Bank runs this project called the UK Threatened Flora Project, where we've been developing information sheets and propagation protocols for some of the UK's endangered plant species. And there's a really nice example where there's a plant called the field wormwood, which is a lovely name, and then even more charmingly, there's a rare beetle called the wormwood moonshiner beetle that depends entirely on that species of, it's actually Artemisia campestris is the Latin name. So it puts it in this very unusual and dangerous position where you've got a highly endangered beetle being dependent on a highly endangered plant, and both of them are on the verge of extinction. There were only 4 sites of this plant left in East Anglia. The Millennium Seed Bank just collected seeds from some of these plants and then is working with Barnum Zoo to establish another site where they've been trying to provide more habitat for this beetle and in an attempt to save the beetle.
I think we also have to think at scale too, don't we? Because we're seeing astonishing things happen here at Knepp, and 3,500 acres, which may sound like a lot for southeast England, but really to have dynamic functioning processes, we should be looking at creating areas, your big biodiversity hotspots of 10 or 15,000 acres, where you've got much more of a safety net, a much more resilience, and how you connect them. We've just started this lovely project called the Wheeled to Waves project, trying to connect Knepp with the sea, using corridors, nature corridors. So we're now talking to everyone from large landowner to farmer to someone with a schoolyard that they're wanting to create some more wilderness in, some wild patches in, to gardeners. And we can all play our bit in creating habitat for nature, and particularly if we can connect with each other.
Yeah. See, we can be so obsessed with the plants and the animals in the landscape that we can forget that the most dominant species in the landscape is actually people, and people are going to determine the success or failure of every restoration project. I mean, I think your situation where you've got a very large area of private land and you can pretty much do what you want is fairly unusual, especially in the tropics, where you've usually got people inhabiting these forests and these landscapes, and they have indigenous people been there for eternity, and in some cases their rights and their interests are overlooked. Involving local people, and especially to achieve this landscape scale restoration or recovery, is really important.
For 20 years we've been looking at the nature restoration in the larger landscape, and we suddenly realised we hadn't even looked at our garden, and there was this huge area of lawn, Charlie's beloved croquet lawn, a monoculture, the worst kind of possible example of what you could be doing for biodiversity in a garden. So we've now, with the help of Tom Stewart-Smith and James Hitchmo, who are brilliant kind of minds and garden minds, dumped 400 tons of crushed brick and concrete onto the lawn and planted 1,000 species of plants from all over the world. So we're not being precious about non-natives. We're having a great deal of fun creating a garden that's sustainable because it doesn't need to be watered, but it's diverse and amazing. And in just 2.5 years, our insect, from the baseline survey we took before we began changing it, our insect species have increased 33%, including some incredibly rare insects that haven't been found yet out there in the Rewilding Project, which you can come and visit, and you can and at Knepp, and you can come and see how it's done. But your own little garden can become a really important hotspot for diversity.
On a national level, Costa Rica is a fantastic example of this. They, in the 1970s and 80s, they had the highest deforestation rate in South America. And then the government actively intervenes. And I think this is a really great example of how policy and governments can make a difference and completely change the trajectory of degradation in a country. And they changed their policies and introduced incentives to conserve and restore their forest around the 1980s. They now have 60% forest cover, and they have a tourism income of over $1 billion. And I've seen an estimate that over 80% of the visitors to Costa Rica come purely for the ecotourism. So involving local people can generate a source of income, and I think Knepp is a great example of this. I think conservationists and ecologists and biologists need to be actively involved in the ecotourism business to make sure that these precious areas are safeguarded and it's handled sensitively. But it is a great opportunity.
Successful regeneration is all about putting the right mix of species in the right places. That means putting into practice all the things we're learning about how conditions are changing, what methodologies, such as the framework species method, we can transfer across continents, and how we can share insights into different contexts. But landscapes can't be regenerated without considering how they'll be used and lived in by species and humans too. Nature doesn't exist in a bubble, and the more we can understand about how systems interact, the more we can future-proof any ecosystem. We'll be diving into that more in our final episode. Join me in a fortnight. You can find out more about Kew and support their vital scientific and educational work at kew.org. And don't forget, you can catch up on earlier series of the podcast on this feed too. Please follow and subscribe.